Welcome to the Josh Hall Web Design Show. Helping you build better websites and create a web design business that gives you freedom and a lifestyle you love.
Hey friends, welcome into the podcast. This is episode 145, and we're going to dive into the topic of a very, very important and fairly common question, especially when you're getting into web design, which is, how much coding should I learn? And we don't talk about code too much on the podcast, mainly because generally if I'm going to talk about code, it's going to be visual, and I'll do it through courses or tutorials. But I wanted to just glance over the idea of what we need to know as web designers nowadays. And I'm bringing on somebody who is, I think he calls himself in the interview a dinosaur. I wouldn't call him a dinosaur, but he is an experienced human in code because he's been in web design for a very long time. This is Mark Lassof, who was a blast to talk to, really entertaining and fun guy to chat with. And we talk about code because he is actually the founder and instructor at a site called FrameworkTV, where they essentially do all sorts of coding programs for a very, very, very inexpensive membership offer for all their students. And he is very well versed in a lot of code and has a lot of experience in web design over the past couple of decades. And this was a really blast of a talk because we dive into this topic of like how much code you need to know now. I'm a big proponent of knowing enough to get dangerous if you need to, but I don't go too far myself in code personally. And as we talk about in this episode, I am no coding expert. A lot of people ask me jQuery questions and JavaScript stuff, and I'm like, I'm going to need to talk to somebody because I don't know. I know CSS pretty well, a little bit of HTML, and that got me by. So I hope that's of some encouragement to you too. For those of you who want to go deep into code, awesome. Awesome. There's such a need for you. For those of you who are a little more like me and just want to learn enough to be able to design sites and customize them, but then work on sales and strategy and running your business, this is going to be for you too. You're going to find out what you need to know and what our recommendations are for you to know enough code to get dangerous, but also to make sure you enjoy every day running your business because there really are kind of two people in web design. People who are the operators and love the code and the tech, and then people who want to run the business and sell and market. So really excited to see what you take from this episode. Again, Mark was a really fun guest, and I really enjoyed talking with him and having him on. Now, like I mentioned, I'm a CSS guy. Pretty much all the customizations that I did on my websites were purely done with CSS. A little bit of PHP, but by a little bit, I mean like a few lines at that. So if you are interested in learning what I learned and getting to know what I know in web design, I put all of my CSS knowledge into my Divi CSS course. And this course, while it is a Divi course, is actually not exclusively for Divi. Everything you learn in the course is just broad CSS, and you'll be able to apply it to Elementor or other themes. I actually have a lot of students that use different themes and still got 100% what they needed to out of the course. So if that's you, if you hear this talk and you're like, okay, I want to get going with HTML and some CSS, join my CSS course today. I would love to welcome you in there, and I'll clear up the mystery of CSS for you. You can actually go to joshhall.co/CSS, and that'll zip you right there. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, here is Mark Lassof. We're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about how much code you need to know right now. Enjoy. Mark, welcome on to the podcast, man. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Josh.
I want to start this conversation off with a question about coding, particularly the state of coding in 2021 now. Before we get to that, though, I would love to have you introduce yourself to my audience. Can you let everybody know where you're based out of? And then if you could summarize what you do, how would you say that? Because I know you do a lot, but what would you say you do exactly?
So I run a company called Framework Tech Media, and we produce video course content, video training around the idea of learning coding. So we produce things that are found on massive course libraries like Udemy and LinkedIn Learning. And we offer our own platform where people can learn to code with us directly at frameworktv.com. I've been I would say a lifelong coder, even though coding didn't exist really in the same way when I was a kid. I started with the Commodore VIC-20 and worked my way up to my current new Mac setup that I've got. Probably had every computer produced along the way and learned how to code on all of them. So I am a coding originalist.
Gotcha. And are you based in Austin, Texas? Is that right?
I lived in Austin for years. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, but now I'm back home in the Fairfield County, Connecticut area, just outside of New York City.
Okay, awesome. Well, what you do transitions perfectly to my first question in regards to coding, because there is such a movement now for builders, and I might be partially a cause to this, which is people who are using themes like Divi, which is what I use. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are straying away from code. And a lot of people, now I'm not saying I'm one of these people, Mark, but a lot of people are saying you don't need to code anymore. How do you feel about that statement?
I think like all things in life, the answer is it depends. I just had coffee with a gentleman who worked with what's called a low-code platform where there's a lot done for you. But here's the thing. All those great tools you use like Divi, somebody wrote them in code. So at some level, the need for coding isn't going to go away. It depends on what level of abstraction you're working with. So, for example, if you're writing operating systems, you're going to need to code. If you're writing video games where speed is of the essence, you're going to need to code. If you're writing financial software that operates trading floors, you're going to need to code. And there's dozens and dozens of examples. I just got a new car that's all the screens are digital. Someone coded that stuff.
Yeah.
But if you're building websites, mobile apps, there are enough tools out there for 90% of what you want to do. You may not have to code because somebody's already solved the problem. I think that a good coder is a lazy coder, and it's someone that will go to tools that already exist before they look for brand new tools or write brand new code in order to reinvent the wheel. Now, that being said, I think everyone can benefit from learning some coding. Because what Divi is doing, what WordPress is doing, or any other tool that you use under the hood is writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. And the more you understand the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, the more you'll understand the metaphors that are used by your tool to produce digital content.
Well, it's a great answer because I've always felt like throughout my career, I've felt like I wasn't great at coding. It took me a long time to figure out CSS. It's not my natural skill suit or my skill set, but I did learn it pretty well, and I'm quite efficient and good with CSS and HTML. I have a course on that. However, I'm by no means an expert, and I have been very, very public in saying I do recommend that you know at least the basics of HTML and CSS, but the good news is for most average web designers, unless you want to go further into JavaScript or PHP using WordPress, you really don't have to. Like, it's an option, but for me, I've always told people I can't imagine building websites without at least the basics of CSS, because to your point, Mark, you said it. You use Divi, 90% of what you can do without code. But there's that other 10%, particularly when you're adding other widgets and contact forms and plugins, to where you may not be able to customize that with Divi. You're going to need to step in and either hire that out or add some CSS yourself to style that and make it streamlined in your website. So how do you feel about my viewpoint of coding, to where I would say you can do a lot without it, but you should at least know the basics? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we're in agreement. I think, a lot of what can be done with the tools that are available, including Divi. And if your practice is within the scope and capabilities of those tools, then while coding will make you more informed about those tools, it is not a requirement. But here's where I think coding has a strong place, and that's in being innovative. And where innovative products are going to come to market, probably someone hasn't anticipated necessarily the needs that your innovative project has. So there, you're probably going to need to write some custom code. The other place is tying in with major tool ecosystems that already exist in the market. For example, if you need to tie your project into Salesforce or tie it into another major ecosystem that's that's out there. And that's where coding can be very helpful. Now, that doesn't mean that you should run out and learn to code necessarily if you're a web developer, even if you're doing sites for other people. But you should have an understanding of the coding process, because perhaps you'll work with a developer and you'll need to understand enough of the process in order to work with that developer effectively and not be wasting time or money or chasing down things that aren't necessarily possible within the scope that you have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, man. I got into web design in 2010, and I really dove into Dreamweaver and, of course, CSS, where I learned the basics of all that. And there was not near of a push or a market for the build websites without code. It was still very much code heavy. And then once WordPress seemed to get bigger and bigger in the marketplace, and then these page builders and more themes came out, I saw such a massive shift from being a web designer, knowing you needed to code, to you could be a web designer and just know a little code, which was what I was thrilled about. But then there was also this blurred line between DIYers. Mm-hmm. Business owners that were trying to build their own site. They had no interest in doing anything with code, nor should they have. And the problem, though, I think with a lot of these builders, including Divi, which I still use today and love, is they're appealing to kind of both markets. You're appealing to the DIYers who shouldn't code, don't want to code, and web designers who, maybe they don't want to be at your level with coding, but maybe they want to be more like me. They want to know enough to be able to do some stuff themselves, but not get too far along in that. What was your perception, being that you've been in the industry for a long time? What has your perception of code and page builders been for the last decade or so?
Well, so you said you started in 2010, right?
Yeah.
I started in 1995. To date myself a little bit, but I'm elderly when it comes to this industry, and I saw the number of cycles between heavy dependence on tools and heavy dependence on code. And it seems to be the preferred industry methodology has gone back and forth, like a lot of things over the years. So the original tool that I used back in 1996 that wrote code for you was called Microsoft Front Page. It no longer exists, and it was terrible. There was also a number of other tools. There was one from Adobe, and it preceded Dreamweaver that I can't remember the name of. And I actually wrote a book on that, and it was awful. And those tools really, 25, 30 years ago now, weren't fit for any human to use, whether they were sophisticated technically or a small business owner, but they were always marketed towards, you don't need to hire an expensive web developer. You can do this yourself. And they were great marketing tools for web developers, because after someone tried to do it themselves and crashed and burned, they'd come hire a web developer. The other thing that I think is interesting when it comes to the history of these tools is the genesis of the web. Well, back when there was something called a webmaster, which actually sounds a little dirty to me, but is never a title that I used. But webmasters tended to come from the technical side. They tended to come from programming and server management and things like that.
That's how I view that term. I view them as like you talk to your webmaster about anything IT related or email, DNS, code, whatever.
That's because you're a normal human. I think of like dungeons and leather and all sorts of things when I hear that term. But regardless, it was an IT position. And then what happened around 2000 is graphic designers got involved. And all of a sudden we had all these mixed metaphors in the tools, because they were trying to appeal to the technical folks, the coders, and they were trying to appeal to the designers. So I think with some tools, you still see some vestiges of that. But I also think the tools have come a long way. And now the companies that are producing tools, including Divi, have a real handle on who their market is.
Yeah.
And you see other tools and DIY systems like Wix, for example, that really require no knowledge whatsoever. But obviously, you have a limited scope of what you can do with them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, every tool, there's a continuum between how easy it is to use and how much is done for you. And on the other end of the continuum is the amount of flexibility that you have.
That's a great distinction, man. That is so important for people to understand, is with a lot of these builders, you can keep it easy and simple as you want, but that's exactly what you're going to get. You're going to have a lot of limitations. Whereas, and I think this goes back to where at least a little bit of HTML and CSS, you can really use that to take your website a long way. For me, it was all about styling. Once I learned CSS, I'm going to call myself a web sorcerer instead of webmaster. I learned how to kind of harness the power of a little bit of code and how far that can go with any theme and with any plugin. So there's definitely, I think you're right. I think it's very clear to make the distinction of where do you want to be in the spectrum of web design? Do you want to be more of a DIYer and not touch any code and just know you're going to have limitations, or you're going to need to hire a lot out? Do you want to be somebody like myself who is a web designer who wants to, get a little dangerous with coding and do quite a bit? Or do you want to be somebody who is doing a lot more high-level type of coding that can really take these things to the next level? And it actually transitions to the next question. Well, I was going to ask this later, but I think now might be a good time to ask this. And that is, if it is somebody who is more on my level, who wants to be dangerous enough to be able to do some stuff, but also be able to talk to developers, what languages do you think this type of person should learn?
Well, let me reframe this a little bit, if I may. Sure. I think the right question to be asking is, what types of projects do you want to be doing? Because that's going to lend itself to a specific path, whether it be becoming more technical and learning the technical end of things, becoming a better designer and learning more about the digital design aspects of things. I happen to be one of these weird hybrids who do both. I'm one of the few programmers who's won an American Graphic Design Award. So, I understand both of those worlds, and you've got to understand the types of projects that you want to do. Do you want to be building brands in the digital space, or do you want to be building tools in the digital space? If you want to be building tools, then you need to be looking at programming languages. Here's a good example. I did a project for a video that I'm doing for last week that is the kind of weather map that you see behind a weatherman that gives you the 7-day forecast. So that project required HTML for the scaffolding. HTML is the scaffolding of everything that appears on the web. It's how you identify the purpose of every piece of content. CSS was for the design, and CSS is so powerful now. With CSS, we did gradients, we did animation, we did all sorts of things just with the CSS, and it looks really cool. It looks, every bit as good as something you'll see on the evening news. And then to talk to the APIs, where we actually got the geolocation information, the weather forecast, and the city and state information, we needed JavaScript. So in order to do that type of project where we wanted to do a custom weather forecast display that updates on its own, well, then we need those three core languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. With those, technically, you can build anything that you see within a web browser. So my program, not unlike yours, starts people with HTML, focuses a lot on CSS, and then JavaScript is the first true programming language, because that's where the interaction can come in. Now, that's, again, if you're wanting to build highly customized sites and tools. If you want to build designs and you want to build brands and if you care how every icon looks and you want to make pixel perfect designs, then the languages aren't as useful to you as design tools like Figma, where you're going to be able to build prototypes that are pixel perfect and then translate those into a WordPress theme or get those into some type of tool that allows you to build websites and make them pixel perfect. So again, you got to understand, what are you trying to do? What's your goal?
Well, that's a good distinction. I like that you reframed the question like that. I back you up on that, because most of my audience are building websites for small, medium-sized businesses, a lot of startups. Primarily more so brochure type sites, but there are a lot of my students doing more advanced projects, particularly in the realm of e-commerce. And a lot of times we have sites where there might be a booking plugin or a calendar or something where, again, like I mentioned earlier, you may use Divi, and you may not be able, or you may not need to touch any code in the initial build, but as soon as you add that calendar, well, suddenly it looks completely different. And if there's no plugin or no styling options, that's where the magic of CSS can come in. And the beauty is, and maybe you'll back me up on this, Mark, it's not rocket science. There really are just a few core concepts you need to know, particularly with CSS and HTML, and then you can run with it and you can go from there. And what I've learned, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, when I became more and more efficient with CSS is when I started using Inspect Element, and I would just look at other websites. And Divi, just like you said earlier, Divi is built on code. If you add one of the effects that is pre-built into Divi, you can just Inspect Element and look at the CSS behind that. That's kind of how I learned. Are there any other? I know you have a lot of programs and tips for learning, but are there any other tricks like that for just dipping your toe into the water with CSS and HTML in particular?
Well, I think first off, CSS and HTML are fundamental for everything that happens in digital. So you can look at anything that's happening interactively on a screen, and there's HTML and CSS behind it 99% of the time. So exactly what you identified, reverse engineering what you see on the web is a great way to learn once you have some fundamentals out of the way. And how you learn the fundamentals, it really depends on what your resources timeline is and how you prefer to learn. Obviously, since I do online courses, that's what I recommend. Yeah. But there are great free materials. There are great courses at community colleges on this stuff. And there's also great books that have been written that'll teach you. It's really how do you prefer to learn and what kind of resources do you have? But I do think the best thing to do is to become a critical consumer of digital products. And when I say that, I don't know if this happened to you, but in college, I took a film class and all of a sudden I can't look at film the same way. I walk out of a movie and I'm like, well, I don't think the protagonist was well defined. I'm talking in this kind of inside baseball way about movies because now I have this knowledge of how films are made and how to look at them critically. Yeah, and I think.
I was just thinking, like from a coding perspective, my CSS course, one of the first things I show in there is it's a warning. I'm like, heads up. After you go through this course, you're not actually going to get too far before you're going to start looking at websites and it's going to look like the Matrix. Like suddenly you're going to see things in pixels or percentages or ems. And then suddenly you're going to say, I bet the padding is, 40 pixels on this menu or this button. Or I can tell that this menu has 20 pixels of padding on the top and then 40 on the bottom. It really is. I totally back you up. You get into it and then suddenly your perspective changes and you're kind of an insider. You're an insider on it.
Right. And I think that CSS knowledge is so foundational to everything that you do that it is important to be able to have that inside baseball conversation about it. And the other thing that code does is it's the equalizer for people who use different tools. Because no matter what tool you use, the end product is that HTML and CSS code. So if you want a way to talk to someone about a digital product, whether that be a website, mobile site, whatever, understanding the code gives you a common communication platform. If you don't understand the code and someone did this in Divi and someone else doesn't know Divi as a tool or whatever tool that you use, it's difficult to talk about it from that kind of critical building perspective that you need.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I was thinking back to when I started teaching, because I don't know how much you know about my path, Mark, but I was a web design freelancer and business owner for nearly a decade. And then towards the last couple of years of running the business myself, I started teaching. And the way I started and how I built my authority was I was creating tutorials mainly around Divi. And it was mainly about how to customize Divi with CSS. Mm-hmm. So it was just these little snippets. And it was fascinating as I look back, but like kind of figure out who I've attracted. It was mostly people a lot like me who could get dangerous, but they were kind of stuck or they may have broke something on their site and they didn't really have a great understanding of CSS. Or it was DIY people who, to your point earlier, started at it and then they were like, oh my gosh, I can't, screw it. I'm never going to do this again. Somebody else hire it out. And that's kind of how I attracted and built my brand was really those two segments. And the reason I say that is it is kind of interesting. You can kind of, I think, figure out what path is best for you depending on, how you're feeling about it and what resources you go into. Like I hated CSS for a long time because I didn't really have any formal training in it. I was doing night school at a community college. There was a class on CSS. That really taught me a lot and that made me feel so much more comfortable. Even though the class was, very fluffy and it took way longer to learn. Like basically what I show in my CSS course will bypass 2 years of what I had to go through with CSS, but it still made me confident. And I think that's where online courses like yours and like mine and our resources definitely help expedite the journey. And
Sure.
it can make it a lot more pleasing for somebody, and because it makes it less daunting. And I actually wanted to ask you about a graphic on your homepage, because so your website, FrameworkTV.com, you guys have a great little visual representation of initial skills and some different languages and where they fall for somebody's journey. And I was looking at this, and like we've talked about so far, the initial skills really start with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is in there as well. Although I'll hold my hand up and say I don't know a lick of JavaScript. I've been able to do everything myself with just HTML and CSS. And then I'm lucky to partner up with some folks who are really advanced with Java and PHP to take that to the next level. So those are the initial languages. There's jQuery, and then eventually you get into more like PHP and server-side stuff. But I say that to say I think a lot of people are just so daunted by code and all these different languages. We've made a good distinction of HTML and CSS, but I do want to touch on JavaScript and jQuery.
Yep.
What are the differences between those two in particular? And for somebody who wants to go kind of the level beyond me, where like I'm fine with enough CSS and I'm good, but somebody who does really maybe have an eye for the development side of things and loves that and really wants to customize things, what would be the next step for them? And then, yeah, if you could talk to me about the differences between JavaScript and jQuery, that'd be awesome.
So when you're bumping your head up against the digital ceiling, which what I mean by that is you have your set of tools and you're not able to do everything that you want to do with those tools, kind of like you went and learned CSS, then it's time to learn to code because the tools aren't sufficient for the types of projects you're doing at that point. So after you have HTML and CSS down, your next step is JavaScript. JavaScript, unlike HTML and CSS, is a full-fledged programming language. HTML and CSS are technically markup languages, which is why they're a little easier to learn. There's not as steep of a learning curve. JavaScript allows you to code the interactive part of the web. So everything from a drop-down menu animation to a video game, to communicating with outside servers that may give you up-to-date information on everything from the train schedule to the weather, to accessing APIs from larger sites like Twitter, all happen through JavaScript. So JavaScript is what powers interaction in the web browser itself. It is the most important language to learn right now, because there are more jobs for JavaScript developers than any other language. And because so much is happening on the web, there's more opportunities and more things you can do with it. JavaScript is a core foundational language. jQuery is a library that's built on top of JavaScript. Now, jQuery isn't sexy. The reason that I recommend it is the most deployed JavaScript library on the web. More sites are using jQuery than any other library. Programmers have a habit of looking at the shiny object and saying, that's what you need to learn, the newest, the greatest. My program and the way I like to teach is I want people to learn what's actually deployed and what's actually out there, because that's where the jobs are. You might have heard there was a little bit of a crisis in the last couple of years finding C and C++ programmers to work on old systems like banking systems and airline reservation systems that still use old.
What a nightmare that sounds like.
Well, because the generation of coders that knew that language started to retire.
Yeah.
And so it was hard to find new people. Well, those languages are 30, 40 years old, and very few people are recommending you learn them, but there's a lot of money and a lot of projects if you do. So that's why I recommend things like jQuery. jQuery is a toolkit to work with JavaScript and make your JavaScript coding easier. It has a bunch of built-in animations. It has a bunch of built-in helper routines that make JavaScript coding easier. But you've got to understand the JavaScript first in order to deploy and use jQuery well. As you become a more sophisticated developer, you might start to use jQuery and JavaScript interchangeably, but you really have to understand what you're doing first. So jQuery is the first library that you use. Now, if your goal is to become employed as a developer, that's where I have that map on my website at FrameworkTV.com that shows you kind of the initial skills, the libraries, the specializations that you need. And there very much is an order to it. And jQuery is the first non-fundamental thing that you learn, the first thing that's not a base language that runs in the browser because it is so deployed and it is so important in the larger ecosystem of web development.
Gotcha. And what about PHP? Because I've always built off of WordPress, inevitably there were times where I would get into the PHP and and when I say get into the PHP, I mean like very rarely would I do that. I can do barely just enough to not break
as
a
a
site.
last resort. You get into the PHP. Yeah.
Yes, it's a last resort. And then after breaking a couple sites, I learned really quickly CSS is as far as I want to go. I'm going to partner with somebody to do the advanced PHP, but it is important. I feel like for WordPress, particularly when you're editing things like WooCommerce files. And I know for example, like with Divi, there was no way to have the copyright year at the bottom of the site populate every year. So I found a tutorial and just figured out how to create my own little PHP snippet in the footer of all of our websites that just automatically update the copyright year. And it worked great. I figured it out. I didn't break a site, and that's the extent of my PHP knowledge. But I still feel like, at least for my audience of WordPress web designers, I would potentially say if they want to learn more, they would learn a little bit more about PHP, maybe even before JavaScript or jQuery. You think that's fair, or would you feel like that would be kind of after those two languages?
Well, I do it in the order I do it because I want people to be employable. I'm not trying to prepare them for a specific stack of technologies to work in. Because WordPress is so closely coupled with PHP, that might be good advice. There is an important dichotomy that people have to understand, and that's languages either work client-side, meaning they're executing within the browser itself, or languages are executing server-side, which means they're executing on the server and they're processed before the data is sent to the end user. PHP is a server-side language, so it tends to deal with issues that are on the macro level. For example, executing an e-commerce transaction, because that's processed on the server, or logging data, or sending an email. Anything else that just happens within the browser is the purview of JavaScript. So which you learn depends on, again, what types of projects are you trying to do. JavaScript has developed a lot over the last 15 years, where now JavaScript actually can be client-side or server-side in a version called Node.js. So JavaScript is becoming increasingly powerful. However, PHP, as I mentioned before, is deployed on millions of different sites out there. So it's also valuable to learn. But whether you learn JavaScript or PHP first really depends on what your needs are and what you're trying to do in the end. Both languages have a lot of value, a lot of marketability, but it just depends, again, on what are you trying to do. If you're trying to build plugins for WordPress, obviously PHP is your only option.
Let's talk about CSS and maybe how it's evolved. And we touched on it earlier because there's so much you can do with it now as far as animations and transform effects and all kinds of stuff. It seems to me that it kind of blurs the line between CSS and JavaScript. Do you feel like CSS is almost trying to become JavaScript in a way by adding more integrations and functions like that? Or do you think it's always going to be very segregated between what CSS does and what JavaScript does?
I think what we're trying to do is make sure that CSS is in the business of anything visual, that JavaScript is in the business of providing logic for the program, and that HTML is in the realm of labeling and marking up the content and the purpose of each piece of content on the site. Keeping a strict separation of powers really is the most advantageous thing. But here is where it gets complex, is it's not necessarily separate domains, but a Venn diagram. And there's going to be places where JavaScript, HTML, and CSS overlap, specifically because all of these values for a website are stored in something called the DOM, the Document Object Model, your browser's memory. And anything that is changed in the DOM, which in turn changes something on the site, whether visible or not, is going to be changed through JavaScript. So JavaScript can implement CSS. It can build HTML. So that's where there's some complication, because they're not totally independent of each other. Now, CSS is developing more and more tools to build a strong visual model within the browser. CSS has added animations, effects, border curves and drop shadows. But also CSS is now adding things through extensions to CSS, like CSS variables, to make things easier for the developer. CSS can now be compiled. So all of these things are happening because it's not just a single organization, the W3C, that's guiding the future of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but a lot of independent developers and companies who are building tools that they need for themselves and then putting them out there to the market. So it's never going to be completely neat and clean. And there's always going to be overlap. But if you think of HTML as your markup tool, CSS as your visual and design tool, and JavaScript as your interactive tool, you're going to be a long way down the road to keeping your own projects within a proper scope.
Yeah, that's good. So you touched on browsers, and I have to ask you about Internet Explorer as a code guy.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that is.
Well, that's the thing. Like, what is the state of Internet Explorer that you have now? Is that going to be?
It's gone.
A follow-up. Oh, I was going to say, like, are they not supporting it at all moving forward?
I don't know what the current. I mean, to be blunt, I'm a Mac guy and I do more educating than building at this point. So I don't know the current state of Internet Explorer support. I know that there's still, a lot of companies that are doing polyfills, meaning they're writing code to provide backwards support to Internet Explorer in earlier versions, but less and less. It's going away. I think right now that Chrome and Firefox and Safari have the market.
Yeah.
Microsoft is just, I think they've decided that they are not in the browser business.
Well, thank goodness, because that was an issue for me for so long, because inevitably I would make something that would look awesome in Chrome and look really, look fine in Safari and Firefox. And then even if they didn't look good on those, I would just, with CSS, you can add the extensions to make that, transition or effect be on there. But inevitably, I would get somebody who said, yeah, I'm looking on my browser and it doesn't look right. And I'm like, well, what are you using? Like Internet Explorer, whatever's on my computer. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I was just curious what you knew of Internet Explorer, because I do kind of wonder. I mean, I know, thank goodness, it's being less and less popular, but I imagine there still are a lot of dated corporate organizations who are still using Internet Explorer as the main browser. And look, to be honest, there's a lot of older folks I worked with who they just didn't know any better. They had their computer and Internet Explorer is what was on it. If it was a Microsoft computer. So
as of June 2021, browser market share, you may or may not find this surprising. Chrome, 65.27% of the market. So that's 2/3. Safari's got roughly 18%. Firefox got 3%. Samsung has 3%. Opera, which I call it the Oprah browser, but it's actually the Opera browser.
Nice.
I used to tell my students that Oprah had her own browser. But anyway, so that's 2%. Edge, which is Microsoft, 3%.
Yeah, I'm looking at one right now too. Are you looking at GS stat counter? Or?
Yeah. I mean, so how much do you want to bend over backwards for 3% of the market that's behind? I remember, so when I started in this, you used to see a lot of things like, this site looks best in, Netscape or whatever it was, and they would try and point you to a certain browser. Then they realized that doesn't work, so all these polyfills were developed for browsers that were outliers. And when I say browsers that were outliers, I'm talking about Internet Explorer that didn't conform to the standard. And then Microsoft decided, well, we need to conform to the standard too. And by then it was too late. People had really adopted either Chrome or Safari as their primary browser, and the browser wars were over.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful news. I always I have a business course, and one thing we have in there in our contract is you want to make sure you make a note that you're not going to support Internet Explorer past a certain version. And it sounds like we could probably just say not support Internet Explorer at all now because it's not a valid browser. But I guess maybe this question isn't fair to you, being that you're not talking client side stuff, but I was curious as far as like what you would tell a client if they were asking about, looking at your designs on their browser. But what would you tell to students who, are all your students in a lot of jobs just not catering to Internet Explorer at all now, since it's so far behind and in the rear view me at this point?
I mean, I don't discuss the specific issues with outlier browsers. We kind of assume compliance at this point. The next big battle for this is going to be mobile. And I think that's what's really interesting now. The mobile browsers for a while were more compliant than the desktop browsers. But now when we look at proprietary mobile apps, a lot of which could be accomplished with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without all the specific mobile coding using Swift for iOS or Java for Android, are people going to start demanding a single code base that can also run their mobile apps? And signs are pointing to yes, where hybrid solutions are becoming more important. So one thing to keep an eye on now is, now that we have convergence on the browsers, where really all the browsers are using very similar engines to interpret code and it will give you a similar result, what's going to happen with the iOS versus Android dichotomy? Is that going to come closer together as standards are adopted and developers don't want to maintain two separate teams for iOS and Android apps that do the same thing and have to be written in two different code bases? I think that's the next interesting area to watch if you want to be kind of where the puck is going versus where it is now.
Well, look, +1 for adding a hockey analogy in there as a hockey fan. Loved it. So I want to ask you a question, almost like I'm going to take this time as a little bit of a free teaching session for myself, because being that I'm not a coder, I always kind of wondered what the difference was between the mobile browsers versus desktop browsers. And thankfully, when you write CSS, you don't have to do something separate for mobile. You can just add a media query, or there's, most CSS will often, you could do it percentage based where it just looks perfect on desktop and mobile. What is the difference between like Chrome on my desktop versus Chrome on my phone? Are those basically two different type of, like, are they coded different? I'm just curious. Or is it just a mobile version of the browser?
Much more now they're similar because the mobile devices have much more powerful processors. The new iPad has the same M1 chip as the MacBook Air Pro. So as we start to see the mobile devices getting more powerful processors and having more resources, the browsers are going to be much closer together. Originally, they were very stripped down versions because so many resources needed to be conserved on the mobile devices.
Is that
now
why
they're very
sites,
similar.
Is that why sites used to have like, you had your website, .com on desktop, and then you'd have like mobile your website?
I think the reason for that was more visual before the real integration of responsive design, which is the process that we teach now. There was always the mobile version where you'd forward to a stripped down mobile version of the site that was an entirely different set of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, as you said, Josh, all we do is we write a media query and we make the changes from the mobile to the tablet to the full screen in the CSS. And usually it just is a matter of moving things around, changing our Flexbox code, and making a layout and arrangement that's appropriate for the size screen that the media query is referring to. We didn't have media queries for a long time. We weren't using them, but mobile devices were a thing. So the mobile version of the site was an entirely different code base. That was a pretty awkward way of doing it because you needed to maintain two code bases in parallel for any changes that you made. The responsive design paradigm is a much better paradigm for dealing with mobile. And I think that's the one that we're going to continue to see used in the near future.
When was the big turning point for that? Because I was thinking back, I feel like 2013 is when I really started paying attention to responsive design. And of course, that's when I got more and more familiar with WordPress, and I started using themes that would adjust perfectly to mobile as they would on desktop. There were two important dates. 2005, with kind of the advent of what Jesse James Garrett wrote a paper, and it was really the advent of DOM manipulation to change the screen. So people could change the view through JavaScript code. And that whole movement then in 2013, I think, around then was kind of when responsive started really to take over as the current paradigm. Look, I tell my students, life used to be easy because 960 pixels wide, that's what we did, and everything was 960 pixels wide. There were libraries called Grid 960, and everything was very easy. Now, I think there's like 27 separate common screen sizes and resolutions. Yeah. And even I have an iPhone SE,
You might have the iPhone 12. Someone else might have, Android device. Even within those, there are so many variations of screen size that it becomes really, really difficult to anticipate. So you've got to make some generalizations through responsive design for the screen sizes you're targeting. I think the important thing for people to know, though, is they should be designing for mobile first, because that's where most of the web views are happening. And then adding to that design for tablet and screen and large screen views versus doing the reverse. It's a much easier road to go mobile first.
There's definitely, I agree. I think there's definitely a lot. It's easier to tweak the design from mobile to desktop versus desktop to mobile.
Yeah.
That said, for most of my small business clients, I always found it really important to look at Google Analytics to see what percentage of traffic was mobile versus desktop. Because like my site, for example, is over 70% desktop right now, because most people are learning and most people are going through courses on their laptops or on their bigger devices. I have a lot of people on the phones and tablets as well, although I found tablet traffic overall is going way down. I'd love to get your thoughts on that here too, but that's a great point, particularly depending on the industry. And I think a lot of it's common sense too. Like for some of my clients, I had a pizza shop. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, I bet a lot of their traffic is going to be on mobile because people are on their phones Friday night looking for pizza. Whereas, if it's a learning site, there's going to be a lot of mobile, but there's also going to be a lot of desktop too. Yeah. So definitely that's a worthwhile point to dive into. The tablet thing. Have you seen any trends on tablets?
I haven't. That's interesting that you say that. I wonder if it's again because now mobile phones, some of the phones are getting bigger and the browsing experience is better, that there's no reason to put down your phone and reach for a tablet to visit a website. I wonder if that's part of it, because that's certainly my experience. And I'm now, and I was never, to be honest, I was never a big tablet guy except for reading books. But now I've abandoned that and I've gone back to just paper, like actual books you can hold in your hand. So I don't know.
It's the best. I
don't know. I don't know what tablets are for anymore.
That's a great point, man. I wondered that too, because I really tried. Like I gave tablets a go because I kind of thought that was going to be the new thing. And I just hated it. I just didn't care for it.
Apple thinks, Apple's promoting their tablets the way you'd promote a laptop now, with the keyboard and that it's your computer.
Yeah.
And if I look at my parents who are in their 70s, that's kind of their computer. They have a computer, but they tend to be tablet or phone first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and again, I think it depends on the type of services that people, as far as websites in particular, that they would go to. I just looked up my stats real quick just to kind of do a case study. So interestingly enough, my site is actually even further on desktop than I thought. So far in 2021, we're recording this conversation in mid-July 2021. My desktop percentage is 87%.
Yeah, but isn't that, Josh, isn't that going to be skewed by people returning to take their courses, not necessarily discovery?
Yes, it is. But the thought would still apply to like how I design the site, because if I design mobile first, which luckily it aligns fine. But and I'm not saying this to try to prove you wrong, Mark, by any means. But I'm just saying
I get it.
It's kind of an interesting case study here. And mobile is 12%, and to our tablet discussion, it's 0.7%. So. It's really interesting. Now, my site is different than most portfolio style sites. I would venture to say most small businesses are much more in the range of like maybe up to 50 in desktop, more mobile. I would definitely back you up on that. Mobile is definitely more important than ever, and I think is going to continue to be more important, particularly for like e-commerce shops and stuff.
I just hope they don't forget about us desktop users. For what I do, because I'm spending a lot of my time in video, since we're producing video, video content, video instruction. I haven't seen anything in the mobile format that excites me, even though there's mobile video editors and things like that. All of them seem awkward and difficult compared to sitting here with my big screen and having all of that visible real estate in order to do things like edit graphics, video, or code. I find coding on a mobile device to be just horrific.
What a nightmare. Yeah. I think mobile is definitely just client side and customer facing, because anytime I get a chance to get on my computer and do stuff, I'm always going to do that over a phone. I even do that like when I'm ordering a product or like even sometimes Amazon or something. I'd rather just do it on my laptop or desktop than do it on my phone. It seems like whatever I do on my phone takes 10 times as long.
If you have these big fat fingers,
it's tough.
Right.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I feel like, particularly for coding and graphics and stuff, I can't imagine, the desktop end of things going away. I know like Apple and a lot of other companies and Microsoft, like whatever, some of the new tablets are out there. They're pushing these graphic programs where you see people with their tablet on a train and like, who wants to do that? I
don't think anybody's really doing it, but here's what's interesting. You have a kid, right?
You have two daughters.
But they're little.
Yeah, 3 and 1.
Yeah. So, I look at older kids. I look at like my niece and nephew, and the phone is everything. It is, what they're doing on their phone. I have employees just out of college who work for me who, I want to be like, get off your phone. And I find out they're taking notes on what I'm saying. They're so phone centric and they are faster with it. So I wonder if there's some generational change there. Me at 47, I just grew up with, like I said, started with the Commodore VIC-20 and I like this keyboard and mouse interface and it's fast for me.
Yeah,
but my niece is just as fast on her phone.
That's a good point. I'm glad you made that distinction. I think that's definitely a part of it. How that translates to learning and the type of ways they work. I guess we'll almost have to see, particularly when it comes to coding.
The disaster that was school during COVID. I don't know if we really know that much about how children interact in a learning environment with the web, but that's a whole other podcast.
Well, but even that point you made of they're taking notes on the phone, I would never do that.
It would take
me so long. I would much rather pull a pen and paper out and do that than
Right.
Now, what's interesting though, I think when responsive design and phones in particular really came into the forefront was the difference between scrolling on websites just like you would with social media. Because I know when I first started in design, even just in 2010, 11, and 12, I can't tell you, Mark, how many clients told me, can you make sure everything fits right on the page so they don't have to scroll? Clients were terrified of scrolling. And I always wondered, why are you so afraid of scrolling? And eventually I told clients, this is what we do. We scroll constantly on our phones. It's no different behavior on websites. So I'm just curious, did you see a shift in that as well with how responsive design affected desktop?
And I think the other thing was like the never-ending page, right? When Facebook and Pinterest and some of these sites started the never-ending page, where it's going to keep generating content for you as long as you keep swiping upward. I think that's something else that changed that attitude. But, I assume your audience listening to this podcast is basically pros or people who want to be pros at developing websites.
Yeah.
There are so many misconceptions that clients are going to come to you with that are flat out outdated, wrong, etc., that you're going to have to come up with. You can't be like, well, that's wrong. You're an idiot. You have to come up with, gentle but firm explanations for why we don't do it that way anymore and how behavior has changed since 1995.
That's a great point. I'm glad you said it like that because that's exactly what I had to learn. It's really easy as a creative person or the service provider for building websites and designs with just like dogging your clients or thinking that they're stupid or, like I'm just going to dog them because it's a terrible idea. But you just said it. You do have to almost educate them as to why you don't want to do this instead of just saying, well, that's dated. That's an idiotic thing to do. If you tell them, listen, we're used to scrolling now. When you get on your phone on Facebook, you scroll immediately, right? It's the same behavior for websites.
If you're not adding value as an expert in how people consume content on the web for your clients, then your client might as well go to the person charging $7 an hour on Upwork in Bangladesh because you're not adding any value. You're just basically an order taker. And you have to decide at some point that, your expertise has value. And that's also how I think web developers increase their worth. It's why I can charge, X number of dollars an hour that someone starting out could never think of getting. It's because they're paying for all the knowledge I've gained since, 1995. I have a very good friend, Nick Floro, who makes e-learning content, so web content that's for learning. And, people ask him, how do you get this good? Because he really is a standout in the e-learning industry. His stuff is unbelievably good, high quality, all built in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And he says, well, in order to get this good, you start 25 years ago. But I mean, that's part of the value that experience adds. And it's part of what people should be adding for their clients is that perspective on how do people consume web content now? Because a lot of clients, their ideas are stuck back in the pre-mobile days.
That's true. And that's going back to the whole, I don't want my website users to scroll. That used to drive.
Or black hat SEO techniques or all sorts of things that they heard from their brother-in-law, who was probably well-intentioned, but not well-informed.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good way to put it. Listen, man, you've been doing this for a while. I'm curious, what resources do you personally use to keep you up to date and to keep you looking forward?
So I tend to give myself projects where I can learn new technology. And for me, it's very much a process of having to use it forces me to learn it.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that is my own ADD. I am pretty ADD for someone, especially who can do development. So for me, I force myself
the best
to have projects.
coders, by the way, best developers and coders.
Well, that's why this kind of archetype of this 16-year-old kid who didn't graduate high school is the best coder on the team. That really exists because a lot of people who don't fit into the larger business paradigms find a home in coding and find that they can do it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's very much learned by doing, giving myself a project. But good resources for beginners, I think W3 Schools gives you the most simplified explanations for what you're trying to learn. I like recommending the next step is just reading the Mozilla documentation for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript once you learn how to read it, and just using that as your base, because that's right from the horse's mouth. And then, you have lots of courses on places like Udemy, which vary in quality from very poor to world-class. And then you have, more juried libraries, like places like Josh's site or my site, where you can take courses that have been, that hundreds or thousands of people have been through and that have been rated really high and that people are willing to pay for. I think you got to find what's comfortable for you. But the worst thing you can do is just go on YouTube and start watching random videos, because then you have no path. You don't know what's next or what should have come before, what the prerequisites are. So I think it's really important to have a roadmap for what you want to learn.
That's a great point. One of my students found me with my CSS tutorials, and when she joined my CSS course, I just reached out and I said, hey, I was just curious why you joined my course. Like, what was the impetus to joining my course when you obviously watched a ton of my free videos? And she very eloquently said, your tutorials were like breadcrumbs, but I realized that I wanted the full meal, basically. Yeah. Like, you're going to get a lot of tips and tricks, but you're not going to get an understanding of the foundation kind of stuff. So I couldn't agree more when it comes to having like a proven path to follow or a full program. And I was actually just looking, the Mozilla resource you mentioned, is that the one that's at develop.mozilla.org? Is that?
I have it bookmarked, so I probably haven't looked at the URL in years. I'm looking right now.
Resources for developers by developers.
Yeah, so what I'm talking about is developer.mozilla.org, and it's called the MDN Web Docs.
Okay.
These are essentially the documentation that's behind the standard. So there's a technology reference for the web APIs, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, SVG, which is a scalable vector graphic, and MathML, which is a mathematical markup language that I don't know or recommend that anybody who's normal ever use.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hadn't heard that before, so we'll link these in the show notes, the Mozilla site, and then W3 Schools. Of course, I'm a big proponent of that. I mentioned that in my CSS course. Great place to learn this stuff.
Josh, can I add one thing?
Sure.
Reading documentation like this is a skill that you have to learn. So, I think one of the things that, I don't know if your course covers it, mine doesn't and probably should, is how do you read and understand documentation? Because there's so much documentation out there, and some of the documentation, like from some sites, actually has its own subculture. about how you ask questions and how you ask good questions. So documentation is really a skill, and W3 skills is a great starting point because it really doesn't require any skills for you to understand. When you get up something like the MDN web docs at developer.mozilla.org, you've got to understand how, for example, JavaScript commands are put together and how HTML commands are put together and what an attribute and a value is in order to understand the documentation. And that's a skill unto itself.
Well, and I think that's a good point too, because I think it's really important to realize where you are before you look into some of this stuff. Because if you just want, if you don't know any code and you just want to learn some HTML and CSS, and then you're on Mozilla Web Docs and you're looking at stuff for JavaScript and jQuery, you don't need to be looking at that yet. We got to build the foundation first. So
or going to a forum that's got kind of an angry subculture and getting pilloried for asking a question that's that shows a lack of basic understanding.
Yeah,
that happens a lot. It's discouraging. I hate that.
That's another big one too. I have a Facebook group that's 23,000 people now, and I intentionally set that up to be a welcoming, warm welcome place for people in all different areas and skill sets of business. Now, inevitably, you do get some tricky points where you've got people who are really advanced and then people who are brand new. And I understand, like, sometimes if you're the advanced side, you want to be talking with people who are on the same level. You don't want to be talking to somebody who doesn't even barely know how to,
Yeah, but you can still be kind to newcomers.
Absolutely. Or funnel them, like have a section for the new people versus section for the really advanced people.
You know the culture I'm talking about here.
Oh, dude, that's why I started that group. Yeah. I was nervous to get in some of these forums with these developers who a lot of them were really talented, but man, they were dicks a lot of times. And I was like, why do you have to be like this? Honestly, it rubbed me wrong.
Is that getting bleeped? Can we use that word?
Oh no, yeah, no, we're cool. Yeah, I don't bleep anything in the podcast. I try to keep it pretty family friendly, but hey, sometimes you got to call it what it is. And when early on, I was very rubbed wrong by a lot of developers. Now you're the rarity. You are somebody who I would feel totally comfortable, but you're also somebody I'm sure who understands the value of educating and sharing what you've learned. I have a
career because I can share complex technical information in an easy, non-threatening way. The fact that that's so rare that I can make a career of it speaks for itself.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point because, there should be hundreds of thousands of you, but there's often
if you want to get into the larger issues in tech, which you don't want to get into, but we will, if you look at the issues that are constantly talked about why don't we have more diversity in tech? Why don't we have more people from underrepresented backgrounds in tech? Why don't we have more women? Let's look back to, we're mean to each other. So why would anyone want to enter tech? There's a huge history of that type of attitude, which I think is going away, by the way. And I look at tech communities in Columbus, where you are, or in Chicago, that are welcoming and affirming and helping newcomers achieve and learn. But that wasn't the norm for a long time.
Yeah, even when I got started, I've talked about this on the podcast, but when I first got started, when I was learning Dreamweaver, I went to a community college for some night classes, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was a contact form, and I had some questions about how the information in the form gets sent, and I had no idea how that worked. And this dude who was in there, who was pretty far along and really advanced, just shot me down and made me feel like a total idiot, like I shouldn't have been there. And it almost planted the seed for me to teach, because I was like, I am not going to be that guy. Like, I want to be somebody who, when somebody is just starting and they're terrified, they feel welcome to ask some questions, and we can guide them in the right direction and get them in the right place and resources.
And even the fact that people come into this terrified, which you're absolutely right, you identified that, is an indictment of the way tech has been taught and the way it's become exclusive for the people who are in it. A lot of that is about job protection and trying to, maintain some professional gatekeeping. So, the field remains high paid, but a lot of it is just meanness. And it's not necessary, and it doesn't feel good. And the generation that's coming up now, the Gen Zers, are not going to play this. They just aren't raised that way. It's not going to be as hard-nosed, and I think that's an important change.
I do too. I've seen that as well with a lot of my younger students. And that is one thing, despite all the political division and crap going on in the world, I will say, and look, I'm 34 now. I'm already getting to the point where I'm like, kids these days,
these damn kids, get off my lawn.
Right? Yeah. But I will say the empathy that is there now and inclusiveness to a lot of different people, I think is awesome. And I think that's a really big change.
It's funny, the kids that, and I'm, I've got 13 years on you, but the kids that I know we would have been mean to in high school are now accepted and have friends and are part of the group a lot. I'm not saying that bullying doesn't exist, it certainly does, but kids that I know would have just been terrorized and bullied when I was a kid are now finding acceptance and kindness and empathy. And I wasn't raised that way. I wasn't raised to be empathetic to others. It's something I've had to learn along the way after a lot of missteps as an adult. But yeah. I think it's a much better ethos for people coming into tech.
I agree. And I was curious if you had seen that on just the developer and coding side, because the cool thing about a lot of communities now, WordPress is an amazing community. There's a lot of meetups and WordCamps. It's a very overall welcoming place. Divi, the Divi community, which is where I built my authority, is even better than that as far as those most Divi folks are extra welcoming, and for the most part. And so what I'm building, I'm trying to make the most welcoming type of communities. And I know you're doing the same. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a big shift over the last maybe 5 or so years in particular that I'm really excited about. So speaking of your community, Mark, I do want to wrap this up. I got one final question for you, but I would love to know where you would like everyone to go to find out more about you. And then if there is anybody who is really interested in taking their coding to the next level, and even if they're a hybrid designer like myself who does design and a little bit of dev, where would you like them to go to get plugged in with you?
FrameworkTV.com. That's our website, and that's kind of the center of our ecosystem. And if you sign in there, you'll get all the information you ever wanted about what we do and how you can progress through our program to become a coder and to be, to earn the certifications, or what we say confidence, competence, and certifications you need to start a career as a developer.
And would you say for folks who are on that level, like beyond me, to where they still want to build WordPress websites and work with clients, but maybe they do want to learn more about JavaScript and jQuery, do you think your program would still be a good fit for them? Or is it mainly meant for people who are
I think our program on our website is mainly for people who want to progress into a job. But if you're in the position where, you're bumping up against the digital ceiling and you just want to learn a little more JavaScript, you want to learn jQuery, you want to learn one of those fundamental things, look up my courses on LinkedIn Learning, Udemy, Safari Technical Library, any place you find courses, and you will find a what I call a kinder introduction to development, but a serious one where you're gonna earn your chops.
That's perfect. And we'll link those in the show notes because I know you have a lot of resources. So so last question, Mark. Hey, first of all, I really appreciate your time on this. This was a really fun conversation. I wasn't too terribly excited to talk about coding because it's not my area of expertise, but I really enjoyed picking your brain. And actually, the more I've realized that sometimes when I have folks on who are of a different specialty than I am, I almost enjoy it more because I learn a lot more. Yeah. Like I had a gal on who did accounting last year, and I was like, I do not want to talk about accounting, but I really enjoyed that talk because it was something I needed to learn. So a last question for you, and you hit on this a little bit to go with the browser stuff, but where do you see code going in particular over the next few years? And what are some of the most important things for people to focus on when it comes to code? That's
a tough question. So if you asked me that 5 years ago, the answer I would have given you would have been wrong. And the answer I would have given you 10 years ago would have been wrong. But let me do my best. I think we're going to start to see more approachable, more hybrid versions of developments that are low code that might be great for people in your domain who want to do more but don't necessarily want to become fully fledged coders. So I see a number of low code solutions that are really, really interesting that are just on the cusp of becoming marketable. I think we're going to see more standardization where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript become a standard on mobile for mobile app development, as well as just for the web. And I think finally, akin to our last discussion, we're going to see a further diversifying of the people in tech, and that we're going to see a field that is more opening and welcoming to people who haven't traditionally been found in the tech field. Maybe those are hopes, not necessarily predictions. But tell you what, have me back on in 2026, and we'll see if I was right.
Well, I was just going to say, maybe I'll rephrase the question. Where do you see code going in the next 3 weeks? And then
next 3 weeks, everything should be exactly the same as it is now. So if that's your time span, you're good to go.
Yeah, that's good, man. Well, Mark, thanks so much for your time. This is great. We talked about a lot of good resources that we'll link to in the show notes. And yeah, really excited to see how this helps some folks out, particularly in the coding area. And then, man, all best to you. I really appreciate what you do, and I'm excited to continue on with you, man.
This was a fun conversation. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Mark. Hey guys and gals, just wanted to pop in with a couple things before you head out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast. I would love to hear your feedback, and it will also help other web designers find the show. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode. Just go to joshhall.co, click on podcasts, and search this episode number, and you'll find all the links, descriptions, and resources we talked about. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, and you'll be notified when the next episode is live. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.